السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. عام 2020 كالح على كل الجهات وكافة الأصعدة حول العالم، ولا سيما في المنطقة وعلى الجمهورية الإسلامية في إيران. عام دمغ مطلعه باغتيال الحاج قاسم سليماني، هذا القائد الإنسان والعالمي الذي لا يعوض بمعايير ومفاهيم خاصة، وختم باغتيال العالم الفذ محسن فخري زاده. وبين الاغتيالين كثير من الحكايا، وحملة الضغوط القصوى والعقوبات والمضاعفات والتحولات الصحية والجيوسياسية والاقتصادية والتموضعية، وسيل من المعلومات الخاطئة والمضللة. في هذه الحلقة الخاصة بالذكرى السنوية الأولى لاغتيال القائدين الفريق قاسم سليماني وأبو مهدي المهندس، وقراءة الوضع الإيراني بين الاغتيالين، واستشراف الوضع السياسي في المنطقة، يطيب لنا أن نستقبل من العاصمة الإيطالية روما السيد ألستر كروك، الدبلوماسي البريطاني السابق وأحد الشخصيات البارزة في الاستخبارات البريطانية MI6، ولا سيما في أفغانستان، وكذلك في دبلوماسية الاتحاد الأوروبي، ومؤسس ومدير منتدى النزاعات. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل، معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Alistair Crook, former diplomat and a senior figure in European Union diplomacy, founder and director of Conflicts Forum. Welcome always to Min al-Dakhil from the inside, Alistair.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be there with you.
Pure pleasure to have you, sir. Well, on the first anniversary to the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, I would appreciate, Alistair, if you can talk about the man. In the past, he would have been called a Renaissance man, a man of many parts, like Leonardo da Vinci, as you say, a ubiquitous man. He was a diplomat, a negotiator, a military visionary, and a loyal servant of his state, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and his beliefs also. What is the deep meaning of Soleimani?
Well, I think what you said is exactly right. This was a man who had many parts, just as Leonardo da Vinci also served Florence, the state of Florence. Qasem Soleimani served it both as a political advisor to the supreme leader, as a strategist, as a diplomat. He was on a diplomatic mission to Iraq when he was assassinated. And he was also noted particularly for being a spiritual man. I mean spiritual not in a dogmatic or doctrinaire way, but in a genuine sense of spirituality. And he comes from a humble background. He was not grandiose. He never had really security guards or much apparatus. He was an unusual, courageous man. Almost you'd say, if you were looking at the old ancient way of expressing it, you'd say it was a heroic man. Mm-hmm. You asked me what is the meaning. I think there are several meanings, but I think one of the most ones, and I mean this in a personal way more than anything, is does his example confine itself to Shia world or to Iran, or is it wider? And I think in a very real sense, it is something much more meaningful for all of us. Mm-hmm. Because here was a man who followed his path. He followed his path, however difficult, however dangerous. I think he wrote letters towards just before the assassination to his family and others, in which he said that he expected and knew that he might be dying shortly.
That's very true.
But nonetheless, he did. Mm-hmm. So it was in the paths of Imam Hussein, really, that you see it, who had to go and face the onslaught, even though he knew he was outnumbered and would be killed eventually, because this was the correct path. It was the only path, this was the path that was meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I think this extends beyond Shiism or Islam. It's something we all learn from when we see an example like that. I think the other meaning that is very important is about the assassination itself. Of course, it's presented as a huge loss to Iran, that Qasem Soleimani was irreplaceable for Iran. It's a big blow, a setback to Iran. And that's a very Orientalist way of looking at it, a very Orientalist. For a start, Iran is a structured state, and it has its checks and balances. But it's more than this, that actually the assassination showed more about the West than it showed about Iran. It showed the West thinks that somehow Iran's just one or two individuals, that these individuals make it up. They don't understand that it is a civilization, a way of being, a way of thinking. And you can't assassinate a way of thinking, a spirit.
The same thing, Alistair, the same thing happened also with Hezbollah on the assassination of the former Secretary General Said Abbas al-Musawi. They thought that Hezbollah is going to dissolve by his assassination. But then came Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and then he was a very big headache and still is for them.
Yes, and so in a sense, I mean, what it shows you is this idea that there's only one truth. You know, the West sees its truth as somehow a fact and a vision that everyone must accept and bow the knee to. But there are other civilizational states, China, Russia, Iran. These all have their own civilizations, their own values, and their own, if you like, political energy. And that's very apparent in Iran at the moment, which is going through, Shiism generally is going through an enormous revival. And how do you deal with it? I mean, to kill either it is Fakhrizadeh or Soleimani, you know, doesn't stop the energy, doesn't stop the ideas, doesn't stop the strategy unfolding, because Iran is an institution, it's a structure, it has councils, it has forms of doing it. So it will go on. And if anything, it's made it much more powerful. One only has to look at what happened in the funeral of Soleimani, both in Iraq and in Iran, to see the extraordinary outpouring of support. And one of the things that was so striking, I mean, in a sense, you know, Trump authorized the killing of someone like Ronaldo, you know, of football. For the young in Iran, this man was a hero. He had a touch, a human touch. He was a soldier, by which I mean he was always on the ground with people, taking a helicopter to the front line, sitting around a campfire with them, talking to people. He was really loved and admired, and that was reflected in a funeral that was almost unprecedented.
That's very true, and that's how his spirituality and humbleness played into his success and being that loved by his not only own people but worldwide. What about the legacy of Soleimani, Alistair?
Well, I think and I started off by saying he was rather like Leonardo da Vinci. And people don't realize that Leonardo da Vinci was also a military strategist. He was the man that designed and implemented the machineries of war, the great big wooden siege engines of Italy and of the region, and was a strategist. And Soleimani, like Leonardo da Vinci, was a strategist. And while this period everyone has been focusing on the nuclear issue and the nuclear weapons, even though those nuclear weapons are quite inappropriate to the Middle East, everyone knows nuclear weapons can't be used in the Middle East. It's too mixed up. We're all too close together, jostling one another in communities. That's not possible. And so he turned it upside down, and he produced a new strategy to alleviate the pressures on Iran. And that new strategy was smart weapons and a periphery, and of deniability, so that it was focused very much on, if you like, strategic infrastructure, and not on people. and not against people. And that's the difference. Look at the big difference. And I think this shows you the weakness of the West, that they've actually had to focus and target Qasem Soleimani and General Wafkhri, two people. Whereas what we've seen in the region in places like Abqaiq, the Saudi Aramco facilities, no one knows who was responsible for these attacks. No one is very sure how they were done. But they were not done as targets against people. They were done much more subtly and in a much more sophisticated way to show the power of resistance across the region. Not by having to sort of kill someone.
Even also the targeting of the Ain al-Assad base, post to the assassination of Soleimani, it delivered a clear-cut message. Now, Alistair, since outgoing US President Donald Trump ordered the drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani and the leading also commander of the Iraqi PMUs, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and their colleagues, of course, a year ago, his administration has argued the attack has two main benefits. Taking out Soleimani helped to prevent a series of attacks he was planning, according to those officials, and his death will deter Iran from further escalations against the US in Iraq and the region. For a handful of Trump's advisors, however, there is a third strategic benefit to the killing of Soleimani. Call it regime disruption. Since then, up till today, did you see any of these US so-called benefits materialize, even between the two assassinations of Soleimani and Fakhri Zada?
No, none. None at all. And in fact, it's very important what you were saying, because actually I think that although there were several motives, one of the most important was that they thought this would, and it was sold this way by the advisors to Trump, that the idea is that Iran was fragile, it faced a lot of internal dissent. It was like a sort of, if you like, a sort of a fragile crystal, and that one hit at the crystal and it will all sort of disintegrate into little shards of crystal, into little pieces. But this, I mean, was a complete misreading of the situation in Iran, complete misreading. And, Iran is not a one-man state. It is a structure. It goes. And Soleimani didn't have complete control of any part of this. It was always by agreement with the Supreme National Security Council, with the support of the government, with the support of the various agencies, that these plans were made. And of course, those institutions will continue on this path because it has been a very successful path. In terms of did it split the Iranian people, from what I just said about the funeral, it actually did the opposite. It's done the same. I think because he was so popular, I mean, his popularity amongst young people, I know, was so high. He was like a football star for them. And what it did was it actually cemented back the young generation into the Iranian Revolution. And they came out and they supported supported him, and they still, for him, he is a model, an icon for young people, as much as the couple.
Allow me to ask you, Alistair, about something also very important that Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh said recently, that Iran, while fully adhering to the applicable provisions of international law, will spare no legal and legitimate effort in order to bring the perpetrators and accomplices of martyr General Qasem Soleimani to justice so that they suffer legal punishment for their action. Moreover, pointing to reports that a US base in Germany was part of the operation that led to Soleimani's assassination, Iranian authorities urged Berlin, of course, through their channels, to cooperate with Iran's judiciary in order to help clear up the ambiguities around the case. Do you have any idea about that, Alistair?
Well, certainly. I mean, this assassination was the first time for many, many years since the war that we've seen a Western state target not a terrorist, not an outlaw, not someone who has acted improperly, but an official of another state on a diplomatic mission, arriving on a civilian airliner in Baghdad, met officially with a meeting scheduled with the Prime Minister, obviously something that would have been easily available for the Americans to find out, and to kill an official of another state with whom they are not at war. They have formal relations through the Swiss embassy. So, I mean, it was an extraordinary change, and of course it's illegal. It's an act of war in many ways, and these things have had very bad precedents, if you recall. I mean, the First World War resulted from a similar assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, and that brought about a war. He was also representing a state in a normal diplomatic way.
Right. Alasdair, allow us to stop now for a short break, and then afterwards we're going to talk about the poisonous pills legacy of Trump to Biden. But after the break, إذا فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. Alasdair Crook, former diplomat, founder and director of Conflicts Forum. Welcome back to من الداخل, sir. Well, Trump seems determined to use his last weeks in power to leave his own legacy in the form of poison pills to his successor, Joe Biden, particularly by complicating any chance to resume a dialogue with Iran. Was the assassination of Iranian scientist Wofkhri Zade intended to block Team Biden or Team A's path to a negotiation with Iran? Did Secretary Pompeo connive at an Israeli provocative assassination?
I don't think that really that is the full answer to it. I know that has been said quite widely that is the case. I don't think that is really the case. We all know that Trump has been his bonnet about Iran. He is totally hostile and always has been, unlike most other areas of his foreign policy. Now, I think there are two things. I mean, first of all, American foreign policy is totally focused and organized around Israel more than American interests, particularly on the Middle East, of course. Now, in that context, I think that Israel and its security establishment have been nonplussed by what Qasem Soleimani and others in Iran have done, which is to create this new deterrence, what I call the red pill deterrence. These are these smart weapons, these smart drones, these ground-hugging missiles that can attack, say, a Saudi Aramco base or an American base in Iraq with absolute precision and undetected. Now, I think Israel understands better than in Washington at the moment the dangers this implies, that if a war is started, if the attack is made on Iran, then this could lead to the destruction of much of the Middle East, including Israel. And so I think they're having to recalibrate this. I don't think they have an answer. So what I think they are looking towards is really, and why they object to Biden's position, is not really because they fear, I think, a new JCPOA, but because I think they really want to switch to a policy of containment forever. That Iran should be under siege, under maximum pressure, always isolated forever. Another forever war, if you like, against Iran. And therefore, is part of this Israel wants to go on with its policy of 1,000 cuts, salami slicing at all Iran's capabilities in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, around the region, and to say this is our policy just short of war. And I say just short of war because I think Israel is not in a position to pursue a war at this time of that scale.
Right.
Minor conflicts, but not a war.
Right. Allow me here. That said, Alistair, well, despite Trump administration's so-called maximum pressure campaign against Tehran, Iran has circumvented U.S. sanctions and exported more oil to China and other countries in recent months, thus providing a lifeline for its struggling economy and undermining the U.S. inhumane measures. Iran will be one of the biggest foreign policy challenges facing President-elect Biden and his, of course, transition team. Is it because Iran has pursued its own independent political orbit since 1979 revolution? That's why the US wants to ensure Iran's style of governance fails and does not spread?
I think actually it's beyond that in many ways. I mean, this what really I think frightens Israel and frightens the West is the energy of Iran. It's civilizational energy. It is a state where it's very visible that it is, if you like, a state that is strengthening and growing and managing and somehow finds the resources to counter, if you like, the JCPOA and the pressures that have been put on Iran, and the other states in the region don't have it, and are explicitly making themselves dependent on Israel and on the United States, even at a time when America is clearly leaving that region. So in a sense, we have a sort of weakening of the old Ottoman Sunni establishment taking place at the same time that there is a growth of Iran as a civilizational state. And this civilizational state threatens the project of civilizational Israel. So Israeli civilization has managed now to draw in and sort of co-opt many of the Gulf states and Morocco and Sudan and others into this, into their civilizational ambit. But Iran is the one thing that challenges it, and as long as there is an Iran that isn't broken, Greater Israel cannot take place and become, if you like, the dominant civilization of the region. So I think it's a profound thing, not just simply about, that it's a challenge to the West. It is a challenge to the West, but it's also something which is more than that in the sense of a powerful example of another way of being.
Deeply rooted into the civilization of Iran, perhaps. Right, Alistair Crook, former diplomat, founder and director of Conflicts Forum, thank you very much for your thorough insights and your ever indispensable perspective, sir.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Always. Bless you and be safe. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.